Forced organ harvesting is the killing of innocents for their organs. They don't consent. They don't even know it's happening. They are not told in advance. They are just blood tested, organ examined, and when a patient comes who wants their organs, they're just sedated and organ extracted, and their bodies are cremated. The organs are brought to the hospital for the patient. That's basically what's happening.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with David Matus, an international human rights lawyer and world-leading researcher of forced organ harvesting. David says the killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs is ongoing in China today.
They're continuing to advertise transplant tourism. So, and the institutions are still functioning. I mean, they haven't closed down these transplant hospitals.
And that genocide is happening in China, not only against the Uyghurs, but also against the Falun Gong spiritual practice.
We called it a cold genocide in the sense that it's not happening all at once. It's happening slowly over time. That's why the term cold is used. I mean, so you don't have this kind of picture of genocide the way you do with hot genocides, but I would say definitely, even though it's a slower moving genocide, it's a genocide all the same.
I'm Lee Hole, this is British Thought Leaders. David Matus, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Thank you for inviting me.
You've been a leading researcher on forced organ harvesting for many years now. Could you give us some background on what forced organ harvesting is and what's happening in China?
Forced organ harvesting is the killing of innocents for their organs. They don't consent. They don't even know it's happening. They are not told in advance. They are just blood tested, organ examined, and when a patient comes who wants their organs, they're just sedated and organ extracted, and their bodies are cremated. The organs are brought to the hospital for the patient. That's basically what's happening. And I got started on this whole issue in 2006 because basically I was asked to investigate the issue. The whole issue started with a statement by a woman with the pseudonym Annie, who made a public statement in Washington, D.C. that her ex-husband had been harvesting the corneas of practitioners of the spiritually based set of exercises, Falun Gong, in his hospital, which was Sujiatan Hospital, Shenyang City, Liaoning Province in China. Other doctors had been harvesting other organs. The Falun Gong practitioners were killed through organ extraction. Their bodies were cremated. So she made this statement public. Chinese government denied it. Coalition, an NGO called Coalition to Investigate Persecution of the Falun Gong, decided they needed an expert investigation of whether this was true or not, because there was just these competing statements. They put together a list of 20 people who could investigate the issue, and I was on the list. I had been involved in international human rights for some time by then, and so they were aware of me. David Kilgour was on the list. David Kilgour is a former, at the time, a former member of parliament, former minister of government, minister of state for Asia and the Pacific. So the NGO goes first to David Kilgour, and he says, well, you can't do an investigation with 20 people. I know David Matus. I can work with him. So then they come to me, and I said, sure, I'd agree to do it. And so basically that's how I got started. Now, because I'm an international human rights lawyer, I get asked to do a lot of different things. I mean, there's regrettably an awful lot of international human rights violations in this world. But very often I could say, go to court, or go to your member of parliament, or go to the media, or I could suggest some very simple way of dealing with it. But with this, it was not so obvious, because what I was told was there's competing narratives. I didn't know which was true. What I'm also told is that the victims are dead, can't testify. Their bodies are cremated. There's no autopsy. That the crime, if it occurs in an operating room in a prison, so there's no witnesses other than perpetrators and victims. The records, if they exist, are prison records, hospital records, not publicly accessible. So it presented, to a certain extent, an evidence conundrum. How do you know which side is true when you can't interview witnesses, you can't see any records, you can't talk to the victim, you can't do an autopsy? Is it just left in the air? Well, this is a sort of issue because in my private practice, I'm a lawyer dealing with refugee cases, and refugees often come to me with a story for which they have no evidence. They just can tell what happened to them. And the person who decides their case doesn't know whether they're making it up or in order to get status in Canada, or whether it's true. So I'm often faced with a situation like that, with an evidentiary vacuum and an attempt to establish something for my client. So I figured maybe this was something I could do, but I didn't know of anybody else who I could tell them, go there, and they would do it. So I said, okay. And of course I knew David Kilgore, and we'd known each other since university days, so I was happy to work with him, and so that's how I got started on it. But I would say that when I started on it, I didn't know which version was true, and I wasn't committed to proving either one or the other version was true. What I was trying to do was resolve the issues, that it could be said with at least some certainty, either this was happening or this wasn't happening.
So you were told there's this heinous crime happening, but there's no evidence and there's no kind of victims that you could talk to. How did you go about building the evidence to show this was happening?
What I tried to do with David Kilgore is set up evidentiary trails, both of proof and disproof. What is the sort of evidence that would establish that this is happening, and what is the sort of evidence that would establish that this is not happening? And thinking of it that way, I was able to build up a number of evidentiary trails in both directions, and I proceeded to go down each of them. And what I found was that the evidentiary trails that would have disproved the claim that this was happening just went nowhere. There was nothing there. But the evidentiary trails that showed that this was happening, or would have showed that this was happening, all produced something. And I mean, this is very typical of legal reasoning. You don't draw a conclusion until you hear all the evidence. And so what I could say, after accumulating all these bits and pieces of evidence, none of which on its own established the claim, but by considering them all together, and also considering the total absence of evidence in the other direction, that David Kilgore and I were able to come to the conclusion that this was indeed happening.
So what kind of evidence were we talking about?
Well, of course, we had a number of evidentiary trails, and it's an awful lot of evidence. The problem what we're dealing with here is not too little evidence, but too much evidence. But it's none of that accumulation of evidence on its own establishes what's happening. It's the totality that does. So it takes a long time to go through it all. There was this Dr. Martin Elliott who told me that he went through the evidence. It took him a year to do so, and he was convinced, but it's an indication of how much time it takes to go through it. But for instance, we had investigators calling into hospitals pretending to be relatives of patients who wanted organs of Falun Gong for their relatives, on the basis that Falun Gong is a set of exercise. Falun Gong are healthy because the exercise, and their organs would be healthy. And so they were asking these hospitals for if they had Falun Gong organs for sale, and the hospitals would say, yeah, sure, come on down. And we had a number of calls like that. Now, that in itself, as far as I was concerned, relevant, supportive of the allegation, not conclusive though, because the hospitals could have been just making it up to promote a sale. But it was relevant. Another is, I talked to a lot of patients who, not patients, but Falun Gong practitioners who got out of prison out of China, asked them what happened. I mean, mostly they wanted to talk about their torture, but one of the things they didn't necessarily want to talk about, but which all happened to them when I pressed them about it, was they were blood tested, organ examined systematically, and they could see that the other Falun Gong practitioners were blood tested and organ examined, but the other prisoners in prison were not. I also talked to common prisoners who got out of prison out of China, who told me the same thing, that they were not blood tested and organ examined. The Falun Gong practitioners in the same prison as them were. Now, I mean, the Falun Gong practitioners, it was a mystery. They didn't know why it was being done. It didn't bother them. It didn't hurt them. I mean, the torture that they were inflicted upon them, in order to recant that bothered them. They wanted to talk about that. But the blood testing organ examination, it's necessary for organ transplants. You need blood type compatibility. You need ideally tissue type compatibility. And obviously you need healthy organs. Again, another piece of evidence, not in itself conclusive, but relevant. Third piece of evidence, demonization. I mean, the Falun Gong were dehumanized through communist propaganda, which, I mean, the people on the street may or may not have believed it, but the Communist Party operatives believed it, the guards believed it, the court system believed it, the justice system believed it, the hospital system believed it. So it was easy in that situation to kill people for their organs because they were viewed as non-human. Another evidentiary trail is transplant volumes. I mean, the transplant volumes were huge in China. I mean, the Chinese government said 10,000 a year. At one point, Ethan Gutman, David Kilgore, and I did our tabulation of the transplant volumes rather than taking the government figures, just by adding up transplant volumes hospital by hospital, and we got 100,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So where's it coming from? They say prisoners sentenced to death originally. How many prisoners are being sentenced to death and then executed? Well, they wouldn't say. But realistically, prisoners sentenced to death couldn't be the source for this volume, because a lot of prisoners, common criminal prisoners, have hepatitis B and their organs are damaged. The law says prisoners have to be executed 7 days after sentence, and yet patients could arrange transplants, including transplants for vital organs, way in advance, which is out of sync with the criminal law. As well, the criminal system for imposing the death penalty over time decreased the number of crimes for which the death penalty was imposed, increased the level of court you had to go to in order to get the death sentence penalty imposed. So it became a lot more cumbersome to get organs from prisoners sentenced to death. So it wasn't a valid explanation. And then eventually there was such a noise internationally about Chinese sourcing organs from prisoners sentenced to death, which they admitted, that they backed away from that admission and said everything's coming from donations. So then we looked at the donation centers, and we'd call them up, and they were closed, or they had, if they were open, they had tiny donations. I mean, statistically insignificant. So it couldn't have been coming from donations. So that was another evidentiary trail, and as you can see, there's just bits and pieces here and there that cumulatively lead to the conclusion that this is happening.
So just to touch on one thing you mentioned there, so these organs, they prefer them because they come from people that do Falun Gong, which is a Qigong practice, and they feel these organs are kind of better quality or something like that?
Well, that's what the callers were saying, but it was no doubt reflective of the patients generally. I mean, that obviously the hospital on the other line, or the doctors who were answering the calls, took the calls as real, and I assume they took them as real because that was a legitimate inquiry in the system in which they were operating. And of course it makes sense, particularly, I mean, if somebody knows that you're either going to get an organ from a Falun Gong practitioner or an organ from a prisoner sentenced to death, you're better off with an organ from a Falun Gong practitioner, because the prisoner sentenced to death is not going to be at the same health level as a Falun Gong practitioner.
So why was Falun Gong being persecuted in this kind of way in China in the first place?
Oh, there's not a good reason. Falun Gong was very popular, and it was originally encouraged by the Chinese government. There was a shift from under Deng Xiaoping from socialism to capitalism, which kind of gutted the ideological basis for communism, and so there was kind of a spiritual vacuum, which to a large extent Falun Gong filled. Falun Gong, from my perspective, looked to be a blending of the ancient Chinese spiritual and exercise traditions, and therefore resonated with the Chinese population. I mean, it was a blending and updating. And and then, of course, the Chinese government was encouraging it because it was beneficial to health, cut down costs on the health system. So it became, in short order, tremendously popular. It went from a standing start in 92 to, by 1999, according to government estimates, 70 million people. According to practitioner estimates, 100 million people. People would exercise outdoors in groups, and there was 3,000 practice stations in China. And at some point, Jiang Zemin and Lu Gan, some of the members of the Standing Committee, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, got alarmed by the popularity. They could see these crowds. And Jiang Zemin sent a memorandum to the Standing Committee, the Central Committee, concerned about it. Falun Gong was not very widespread, but it was also up and down the party. I mean, there's a lot of party practitioners, government practitioners, and so there was a lot of leakages. I mean, the letter that Jiang Zemin sent to the Standing Committee was not public, but it was leaked. There'd been a prior incident, some publication in a university criticizing Falun Gong. Within the Communist Party, I mean, there's no elections, we know them here in Canada, with competing parties kind of advocating to the public that the public should vote for this party rather than that party. I mean, you do get power struggles within the Communist Party, but they don't take the form of elections and appeals to the public. Instead, what you have is internal struggles, and the internal struggles are, this is better for the party, that is better for the party, the people within the party that are ambitious have these kind of agendas of what's good for or what they think is good for the party, and hope to succeed politically by promoting their views of what's good for the party. So some people within the party see this mass movement of Falun Gong, and they say, these people are not communists, we've got to repress them because they're not communists. Other people within the party say, they're harmless. I mean, they've got no political agenda, all they're doing is doing exercises. So that became an internal power struggle within the party about what to do about Falun Gong. And eventually it percolated up to the Standing Committee, and Jiang Zemin took the side of the anti-Falun Gong component of the party on this issue. Lu Gan, who's another party figure, was ahead of him on this, but couldn't have carried the party on his own. There was a demonstration well, it wasn't really a demonstration. It was a gathering of people sent to the petition office. They were there was a group complaining about an article in a university publication, I think it was in Tianjin, about Falun Gong, and they were complaining, and the local university says go to the petition office in Beijing. So the practitioners show up to the petition office in Beijing in large numbers, and this gathering alarmed Jiang Zemin. Said it was the biggest gathering in the Tiananmen Square area since the Tiananmen Square massacre, although he didn't call it the massacre. He was just concerned about the size of Falun Gong. It was just too large, not communist. Also, it was not atheist, it was spiritual. And so he basically felt threatened by the size of the movement. And it was nothing more than that that led to the repression of Falun Gong. I mean, the party was used generally to getting its way about do this and people do it, don't do this and people don't do it. And they assumed all they had to do was say Falun Gong is repressed or stopped, and people would stop. And they were blindsided by the fact that people just continued. And continued to practice, continued to protest. Well, started to protest after the initial statement of that was announced on July 20th, 1999, that the practice should stop, and so that led to much worse persecution.
So you released your report in 2006. There were updates and a book as well. What did the CCP say? Did they kind of admit to what was happening with the organ harvesting? Because if people are internationally finding out about organs, there must be some form of promotion of it all.
Well, they certainly were promoting the sale of organs around the world through brokers and through websites. And I mean, you can still see them today. I mean, Love Handy still advertises transplant tourism into China today. They're on the internet. But they weren't, of course, saying we're killing prisoners of conscience for their organs. But they denied in such an odd way, because I'd gone through the exercise of figuring out what's the case for, what's the case against. I knew what the case against was, but they couldn't figure it out. They said the strangest things. They said I was anti-Chinese, but obviously, if I was anti-Chinese, I wouldn't really care whether some Chinese were killing other Chinese. I mean, I'd have to care about the Chinese to care about that. They would say I was repeating what Falun Gong told me, but I knew very much that was not the case. I mean, the Falun Gong were repeating what I was saying rather than the other way around and what David Kilgore was saying. They had this, they actually produced a documentary through Phoenix TV in Mandarin in Hong Kong where they tried to rebut our report, but in such a strange way that it really affirmed what we were saying. They interviewed one of the doctors that are investigators called Lu Guoping and presented him with a transcript of the conversation we recorded and asked him, did you get the skull? And he said, yes. Asked him, did you say these things? He said, yes, except for all the stuff about Falun Gong. That I didn't say. And so they're accusing me of, and David Kilgore, of just fiddling with the transcript. Mm. They don't acknowledge that there's a recording, and they don't explain how we seamlessly could have interwoven in his own voice what he denies having said and what he admits having said.
批发价，比如说，就说你们以前用的，就说是从哪里找？是看守所还是到这个监狱呢？
监狱里面找的。
哦，监狱里啊，他那种就是都是那种健康的法轮功是吧？健康的法轮功。
对，肯定是选好的才能做完，因为这种东西做了要保证质量的。
I mean, it's just such an implausible explanation that they're really. I mean, they're so used to people agreeing with them that they don't even think through what a proper answer would be to someone who disagrees with them. This sort of material is generated for people who don't have access to an opposing point of view. It's not really designed to convince anyone. And the fact that they couldn't even think of a good answer to the evidence that I produced, not even as good an answer as I could think to the evidence that I produced, led me to think that really this must be happening. I mean, their very denials was a further evidentiary trail in favor of the conclusion that this was happening.
So that documentary was pretty much their only rebuttal that they gave.
Well, no, they would make statements. Like, you know, there was another interesting incident, which is equally foolish, I would say. Jay Levy, who's a doctor in Israel, asked me to speak at his hospital, Bellinson Hospital in Israel near Tel Aviv, about this issue. The government of China heard about it. They called up the foreign ministry of the government of Israel asking them to cancel the event, and the foreign ministry passed it on to the hospital. Hospital said no. They then asked, the Chinese embassy asked the foreign ministry to ask the hospital to disinvite me. The foreign ministry passed it on to the hospital. Hospital said no. The Chinese embassy then asked the foreign ministry to ask the hospital to disinvite the foreign Falun Gong practitioner who was on the panel, and instead invite a member of the Chinese embassy. And to that, the foreign ministry passed that on to the hospital, and to that the hospital said yes. So I'm on this panel without the Falun Gong practitioner and with a representative of the embassy. The representative of the embassy gives a speech, the text of which I have, which says that all I'm doing is, in my report, the report I wrote with David Kilgore, is repeating rumors passed on to me by Falun Gong. And then he proceeds supposedly to quote excerpts from our report. And he has these quotes, it was said that, or we were told that, or we heard that. And he has this sequence of quotes to show that this was all rumor. But of course, I mean, I could word search what we wrote, and none of those phrases which he says to be quoting are found in our materials. And it's not a very elaborate exercise to word search. I mean, it was obviously false and very easy to establish it was false. So it was just like utter nonsense. So what I would say is, I mean, this Phoenix documentary is one example. This Bellinson debate is another example. But it's time and time again I see them saying something, but it's just nonsense. And so, I mean, if that's all you can say an answer is nonsense, it means you don't have an answer. It means it must be real.
What reaction have you had from the international medical community, particularly transplant surgeons who hear what their colleagues in China are doing?
Well, I would say it's been split. I would say that there's some transplant surgeons who are under the illusion that they can wean China away from transplant abuse by contact, negotiation, friendly conversations. There's others that realize, I would say, that that's not going to work, that all you're going to do when you do that is get them to say what you want them to say, and they'll just walk away and carry on doing what they're doing. And so there is, I would say, a split within the profession. Jay Levy, I mentioned, who's very keen on addressing the issue, has done some research on the issue, has written some articles on the issue, and he's involved in the Heart and Lung Transplantation Society, which has basically said they're not going to publish any transplant research from China or allow speakers to come to their meetings and so on. I mean, that's heart and lung, but the rest of the profession is not like that. The Canadian Society of Nephrology and the Canadian Society of Transplantation have produced a good ethical statement, basically. For transplant tourists, don't give them prescriptions, don't give them medical records, warn them. And in some countries, they don't specifically mention China, but in some countries, if you go abroad, somebody may be killed for their organs. So it's much more a sophisticated ethical statement than in many other countries. But I would say there's other transplantation professionals who, I mean, some of them are just not engaged. They just don't get involved in the issues. But others are basically prepared to negotiate, accommodate, visit, invite, and have discussions about the issue as if that's going to change things.
What about governments? Have many governments taken action to stop people going to China to get organs?
Well, we do. I mean, there's 20 countries that have got legislation now making it an offense to get involved in organ transplant abuse abroad. Canada's one, UK's one. There's altogether there's a Council of Europe treaty on the issue, the Convention Against Trafficking in Human Organs. There's 15 states parties, which is quite few, but it's certainly better than none, and it's in force. And there's 5 other countries besides that have enacted the necessary legislation. So that there is some. When we started, I mentioned evidentiary trails, and one of the evidentiary trails we looked at is what can stop this, and the answer is nothing. This wasn't illegal in China. In fact, I mean, much to China has produced many surprises to me, but one of them was that they actually have legislation which say it's legal to source organs from prisoners without their consent if their bodies are unclaimed. It was a 1984 law, and there's a 1979 law which says something similar if it's for research. The organs are sourced for research. But everywhere else around the world, I mean, some countries have nationality jurisdiction rather than territoriality jurisdiction. And for nationality jurisdiction, the criminal law operates for nationals abroad without specific extraterritorial legislation. France is like that, for instance. But UK, Canada, there's territoriality jurisdiction, which means for the law to operate abroad, you need extraterritorial legislation. And when we started, there wasn't any of that anywhere. And now there's at least 20. But one of the gaps in the system, still pretty well everywhere, is mandatory reporting. Because even with nationality jurisdiction or extraterritorial legislation, how do you know what happened? Because when somebody goes abroad, there's no exit controls. Anybody can leave. Some countries have exit controls, but most don't. Canada doesn't. UK doesn't. When you come back, you could be asked about what were you doing, but mostly, like if you come back and you've got a UK passport, you just get in. Similarly in Canada, they don't ask you any questions, or they might, but they certainly don't have to. And it's more idle chit-chat than a real investigation. So that, so the system doesn't know. I mean, even the system with laws doesn't know what people are doing abroad. And the only way to get at that is mandatory reporting by the health system to the health administration about transplant tourism. Because transplant patients need anti-rejection drugs for the rest of their lives. So the health system back home knows about transplant tourism, but normally the health system wouldn't tell anybody because of patient-practitioner confidentiality. And the only way you break through that is a system of mandatory reporting. Taiwan has mandatory reporting, and it's interesting that they would have it because, of course, they're going to know more about what's going on in China than almost anybody else. But I'm not aware of any other jurisdiction that has it. And so that's still a gap in the system that needs to be filled.
So your report first came out 17 years ago. Is this still going on in China now?
What we see with organ transplant abuse is a rolling cover-up. Every time I quote someone, he denies he says it, and then takes down, and the party takes down the statement that he said it. Everything is archived, but the official party line just shifts with the evidence. Similarly with statistics. I can get statistics about volumes of particular organs or in particular hospitals or nationwide. I quote them, the reporting series disappears. This is pretty comprehensive. So over time, the evidence that's available to piece together what's happening now as opposed to yesterday becomes harder and harder, because each time, like we did a report 2006, 2007, 2009, 2016, and each time, every time we put out another report, we see an advancing cover-up. But one thing they can't cover up is the transplantation industry. They built all these hospitals based on the prisoner of conscience, an inexhaustible supply of prisoner of conscience organs. They hired all this staff based on this inexhaustible supply. They put in all these beds in hospitals based on this supposed supply, and they're continuing to advertise transplant tourism. So, and the institutions are still functioning. They haven't closed down these transplant hospitals, and there's still no obvious explanation other than prisoners of conscience. And one thing actually that has become more visible recently than before is what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, because, and this is something that we never saw with Falun Gong, because Falun Gong organs were all sourced locally, but because Falun Gong was everywhere, but the Xinjiang Uyghur organs are being shipped from Xinjiang throughout China. So we have a Radio Free Asia report about flight shipments of organs from Xinjiang. We have airport signs in the major airports in the Xinjiang province, human organ transport lanes, and so and you can just see them at the airports. We've got pictures of them, and this is new. So what's happening, of course, is over the course of years now. Since the early 2000s, it's decades. The mass volume of in the hundreds of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners arbitrarily indefinitely detained, the volume's been depleted through their mass killing through organs, and so this health institutional system, hospital system that's selling organs around the world, they need another source of organs or other sources of organs just to keep this industrial scheme operating, and so there's a replacement, not entirely. The Falun Gong are still victims, but at least partially by Uyghurs that now being shipped out of Xinjiang.
So obviously, 17 years is quite a long time in terms of technology. Have you seen any changes in what's happening with organ harvesting based on movements forward in technology?
Yes. Well, first of all, I would say that the very advent of transplant technology made this mass killing possible. The Nazis did all sorts of horrible things, but they didn't do this because transplant technology hadn't developed at this point. It's something that developed after World War II. And technology itself is morally neutral. It can be used either for good or bad, but with transplant technology, the people who developed it didn't really anticipate. It was developed for human good, not to kill prisoners of conscience. And so the people who developed it didn't really think about it in this way. As a result, there was no system of prevention and remedy that was instituted at the time that the technology developed. And also, the fact that it was developed for human good has led to a lot of disbelief. You can understand with tanks or machine guns, if there's a better development, it can lead to more killing. But sometimes people find it hard to believe that something like transplant technology was developed for human good would lead to more killing. That's been a problem. But the problem accumulates as transplant technology develops, because as transplant technology develops, the killing becomes more efficient and it becomes more widespread. And one of the limitations of transplant technology initially was a short ischemic time, the time that the organ can live outside the body, as a result of which organs in China and everywhere had to be resourced locally, because you flew them around, you lost time, and organs would not survive. But now what they've developed is fluids, refrigeration, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation machines, ECMO machines that can allow for greater ischemic times and basically allows for organs to be shipped from Xinjiang to the rest of China with the organ surviving and being viable for transplant. So it was, I guess, you could say, an unhappy coincidence for the Uyghurs that as the Falun Gong organ supply was being depleted, the ischemic technology developed to the point where the organs of Uyghurs could be used. I mean, the Uyghurs, like the Falun Gong, were not initially detained en masse for organ transplant purposes. I mean, Falun Gong were initially detained because of their popularity. The Uyghurs were initially detained en masse because of a terrorist incident, for which the regime of Xi Jinping blamed the whole Uyghur population rather than the terrorists themselves. But then, once you had this massive, arbitrarily indefinitely detained population and this organ transplant industry sourcing organs from prisons, they both in turn just became victims of this machine.
From your point of view as an international human rights lawyer, is what's happening to Falun Gong in China a genocide?
Yes, well, I actually even wrote an article about that with Maria Chung and Richard Ann, which was published in the Institute of Genocide Studies. And it's one of their most popular articles, I believe. And we called it a cold genocide in the sense that it's not happening all at once. It's happening slowly over time. That's why the term cold is used, and we talked about how that's so. The definition of genocide is, mass killing. Obviously that occurs with intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. And, I mean, not everybody who's involved in the mass killing has that intent, but surely some do. I mean, this is ultimately directed by the Communist Party, and for the Communist Party, that's their motivation, at least one of their motivations. And so it fits within the definition. Now, many genocides, because they're hot genocides, you can see the ravages immediately. Like, of course, with the Holocaust, the Allies liberated the death camps, so you could see the bodies. But like with the Rwandans also, that happened in a few months. And so when there's mass killings immediately, they're a lot more visible. But a cold genocide over time, in this context where you don't see the bodies at all. I mean, they're all cremated. I mean, all you can see is crematoria, but crematoria are not unusual in China. I mean, that's the common way of disposing of corpses. It's relatively uncommon for dead people to be buried. Mostly they're cremated in China. So, you don't have this kind of picture of genocide the way you do with hot genocides, but I would say definitely, even though it's a slower moving genocide, it's a genocide all the same.
There's been talk for many years of the Communist Party falling in China, but we continue to hear new horrors coming out. For example, you talked about the Uyghurs and the big internment camps, etc. Do you feel anytime soon we will see positive developments in China?
Of course, I mean, my general attitude is, for myself, don't predict the future, try to make the future. I mean, the future depends upon us. And if we don't want the Communist Party around, get rid of them. But I would say generally, because I've been involved in this human rights business more or less all my professional career, what I see is that regimes appear very rigid and then they disintegrate all at once. And I sometimes use the metaphor of a pane of glass. I mean, you can hit a pane of glass, knock on it with your finger or your knuckles, nothing happens, it just doesn't budge. But if you keep on knocking on it, eventually it just shatters all at once. And I heard a talk recently at a conference I was at about how very few people have made very big changes. One example was Lech Walesa in Poland. He climbs over a wall and decides to rally some people to call a strike, and the whole regime just collapses. And we've seen something like that in China recently. I mean, they completely flipped on COVID. At one point, they were very strict, and then they just let everything go. And basically, because of a fire in Urumqi where some people were killed, and they couldn't get out because of COVID restrictions, and it just had reverberations across China to the point where the party realized that its COVID policy was unsustainable. And right now, with the killing of Falun Gong, the killing of Uyghurs, the repression of Hong Kong, repression of Mongolians and Tibetans and so on, it's all, I mean, the way the Communist Party portrays it, it's us against them. But when people start to realize generally that it's the Communist Party against everybody, then it'll just collapse.
David Matus, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Okay, thank you again for inviting me.